Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. You know how this works. We grab a stack of super interesting source material and we dig in to pull out the coolest stuff to share with you guys. And oh, today we are diving into the life of Frederick II. He was this medieval ruler, fascinating guy. They actually called him the wonder of the world.
A wonder of the world.
And our main source for all this is an article by Extra History. You know, that historian who always makes history so engaging.
And what's even cooler about this deep dive is we aren't just looking at Frederick II's life. We're also going to kind of step back and look at how history gets told, like how those stories change over time and what shapes them.
Right, like what makes it into the history books and what gets left out. So get ready, because we're going on a wild ride through medieval power struggles. We'll see how identities changed, and who knows, maybe we'll even uncover some really surprising historical twists along the way.
Oh, for sure.
Okay, so to set the stage, Frederick II, this guy, he was crowned Holy Roman Emperor, King of Sicily, and King of Jerusalem. Talk about a triple crown. But he wasn't just chilling on a throne, he was navigating this world of intense political and religious tension.
Absolutely. He was always butting heads with the Pope. Always. And his policies, well, we are going to take a good look at those through a modern lens because they were definitely interesting, to say the least. And his legacy, it's still debated by historians even now, all these centuries later.
And I think to even begin to wrap our heads around those classes with the Pope, we really need to grasp how ridiculously powerful the papacy was back in Frederick's day. Like, really powerful.
Oh, yeah. Today, when we think about the Pope, it's mostly like a religious figurehead, right? But back then, I mean, the Pope was a major political powerhouse.
Yeah.
He literally held what they called the crossed keys.
The crossed keys, what's that all about?
Well, it was this symbol, right? And it represented both spiritual and earthly power, both.
Whoa, wait, so you're saying the Pope wasn't just the head of the church, he was a ruler too, like a king?
Exactly. He ruled over what they called the Papal States, which, get this, were smack dab in the middle of Italy.
Oh, wow. Right in the center of it all.
Right. So that made them super powerful, but also really vulnerable. They were constantly caught up in wars and political schemes, always trying to hold on to their power.
Man, I never really thought about how religion and politics were so completely intertwined back in medieval Europe. Like, how did anyone even dare to challenge the Pope's authority with all that going on?
Well, Frederick II did. That's the thing. He was a total outlier. Their clashes were legendary. I mean, like epic, knockdown, drag-out fights fueled by this struggle for power within the Holy Roman Empire.
And the Extra History historian actually recommends a couple of books if you want to dig deeper into all that.
Yeah, Frederick II, The Wonder of the World by Richard D. Bressler, and Frederick II, A Medieval Emperor by David Abulafia.
Excellent. Definitely going to check those out. Okay, so before we jump headfirst into that whole power struggle, the historian brings up something super interesting. This concept of, get this, national myths.
Oh yeah, national myths.
It's this idea that the way we think about nations and national identities today, it's all kind of made up, looking back. Like, it wasn't always that way.
Yeah, like it's constructed afterward. A good example is this term Rex Teutonicorum, which means King of the Germans. But here's the thing. They were using this term way before there was ever, like, a unified Germany.
Right. And remember how we were talking about the Papal States? Well, even Italy back then, it wasn't a country like we think of it. It was more like a region with all these different groups, each with their own little kingdom fighting for power.
Totally. It makes you wonder how much of what we think we know about the past is really, just stuff we made up later.
Right. It really throws a wrench into those neat little boxes we try to put history in.
For sure.
Yeah.
It makes you realize that history is, it's not set in stone. It's always changing depending on who's telling the story.
And it makes you wonder if the same thing's happening right now, right? Like, how are we shaping the story of today, and how will that story be told hundreds of years from now?
That's a question to really think about. And you know what? The historian recommends a fantastic book about this very thing. It's called The Myth of Nations by Patrick Geary. I highly recommend giving it a read.
Will do. Okay, so as we continue to explore Frederick II's world, let's keep that question in the back of our minds. How are the stories we tell about history shaping the way we see ourselves and the world around us? How is history shaping us right now? It's mind-blowing, isn't it?
It really is. And speaking of things that are mind-blowing, there's this really fascinating tidbit in the article about the Dome of the Rock. Did you know that those iconic blue tiles, they weren't added until the 16th century?
Wait, seriously? So what we see today, this ancient, seemingly unchanged landmark, it's not the whole story.
Nope. And get this, the gold plating, even later, like 20th century. It's
Yeah.
incredible to think about, right?
Ah.
Even something that seems so solid and permanent as, a historical landmark can change and evolve over time.
Yeah, it's like history is constantly being rewritten, even in the physical world. It really drives home the point that history isn't static, it's constantly being reshaped and reinterpreted.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's get back to Frederick II. What made this guy so remarkable that he earned the nickname the Wonder of the World? What set him apart?
Well, now that's where things get really, really interesting. Well, for starters, Frederick II was incredibly intelligent and super curious about
Yeah.
everything. Like, he was fluent in 6 languages. Can
Mm-hmm.
you imagine that six? And he even wrote this whole treatise on falconry.
Falconry.
Falconry. It's considered a masterpiece even to this day. Like, people still study it.
That's pretty impressive. Okay, but how did all that book smarts translate into being a ruler? Like, did it actually help him?
Oh, absolutely. It wasn't just hobbies for him. His intellectual pursuits, they really shaped the way he governed, like his language skills. For instance, he spoke Arabic fluently,
Mm.
and that meant he could actually talk directly with scholars and diplomats from all these different cultures.
So no need for translator.
Right. And that really helped him build relationships and alliances all over the place. It was a huge advantage.
So he was like a Renaissance man way before the Renaissance.
Kind of. Yeah, he was a big supporter of the arts and sciences. And his court became this, like, center for intellectual exchange. People were coming from all over the Islamic world. Jewish communities, Christian Europe. It was a melting pot of ideas.
Wow. That kind of cross-cultural exchange must have been super rare back then. Like, wasn't medieval Europe pretty isolated?
Oh, yeah, it was. And that's what made Frederick II so different. He was open to new ideas, different perspectives, and it really set him apart. Take his interactions with the Jewish populations in Sicily, for example.
Oh, yeah, I remember reading about that.
Huh.
He granted them certain rights and protections.
He did. It was actually pretty progressive for the time. But, we have to be careful about judging the past by today's standards.
Right. It's like comparing apples and oranges.
Exactly. While his policies towards Jewish communities were definitely more tolerant than some other rulers at the time, they were still part of that whole medieval power structure.
So we can't just put a halo on him and call him a good guy just because of a few policies.
Right. We need to consider the whole picture, the good, the bad, the
Mhm.
complicated.
The full shebang.
Exactly. And that complexity applies to his political and military moves, too. He was a brilliant strategist and diplomat. He knew how to play different groups against each other to get what he wanted.
And he was a pretty good military leader, too, wasn't he?
Oh, yeah. He had some major wins in Italy and the Holy Land.
Uh-huh.
That definitely added to his rep as a powerful ruler. This guy, Frederick II, he really was multi-talented, intellectual, diplomatic, military.
Mm-hmm.
It's not surprising they called him the Wonder of the World.
But like we've been talking about, history is never simple. Black and white, right? Alongside his achievements, he had his fair share of critics. And I think his biggest rival was the Pope, right?
Oh, yeah, the Pope.
Hmm.
Their clashes were legendary. It was like a battle of the Titans. Remember the crossed keys? That symbol we talked about earlier about the Pope's power? Well, that became a huge point of contention between them. Both Frederick and the Pope wanted to be top dog in the Holy Roman Empire.
It was a total power struggle, playing out on every level, religious, political, military.
Exactly. It was a clash of two massive forces. And it makes you think, was Frederick II some kind of visionary leader ahead of his time? Or was he just a ruthless guy who would do anything to get what he wanted?
Tough question.
It is.
Yeah.
And that's what I love about studying history. It forces you to think critically.
Mhm.
It's not always easy to categorize people as good or bad. It's more nuanced than that.
Totally. Okay, so I want to circle back to this national myths idea for a sec. We talked about how the term Rex Teutonicorum existed way before there was a unified Germany. Can you walk us through how that actually played out? Like, how did Germany actually become a nation?
Sure. So even though the idea of a king of the Germans was floating around, the actual unification of Germany didn't happen until the 19th century.
Wow, so that's like centuries later.
Yep. And even then, it wasn't simple. It was driven by politics, people with different visions of what it meant to be German.
So basically, the idea of Germany wasn't this like preordained thing, it was something that people actively created.
Exactly. And that creation often involves cherry picking, highlighting certain historical events or people while downplaying others,
Oh.
all to make a story that fits a specific view of the nation.
So it's like writing a story with an agenda, even if that story isn't the whole truth.
You got it. And once those stories take hold, they can be super powerful. They shape how people see themselves, their history, their place in the world.
And that makes me wonder, what other national myths are we buying into without even realizing it, you know? What stories have we been told that maybe aren't the whole picture?
That is a fantastic question, and it's something we should all be asking ourselves as we learn about history and as we try to understand the world around us. Because let's be real, history is full of these evolving narratives.
Right, and I think Frederick II is a perfect example of how one person can be seen in so many different ways throughout history.
Oh, definitely. His legacy has been viewed through all sorts of lenses, often reflecting the biases of the historians and the societies interpreting him, you know.
Like, for example, during the 19th century, when the idea of a unified Germany was really taking off, some historians portrayed Frederick II as this early German nationalist.
Even though that concept wouldn't have even existed back in his time, it just shows how our own present-day concerns can color how we view the past. It's fascinating.
Totally, and it's not just his connection to German nationalism that's been reinterpreted. His policies towards Jewish populations have also been read in different ways.
Right? Some see him as a tolerant ruler for his time, while others say he was just being pragmatic, not really driven by some deep belief in religious freedom.
So even centuries after he died, Frederick II is still this controversial figure. His story is still being debated and rewritten. It's like he's still alive in a way.
In a way, he is. And that makes me think,
It makes me think that maybe there isn't one right way to view a historical figure like Frederick II. You
yeah,
know, like maybe we're all just seeing different pieces of the puzzle.
that's a really insightful point.
Yeah.
I think you're right. There's no one definitive interpretation. We just have these pieces.
Mm.
And historians, they're constantly trying to fit them together
Yeah.
and debating which pieces go where.
And isn't that what makes studying history so cool? It's not about memorizing names and dates. It's like trying to solve a mystery, right? Trying to understand these complicated people and what they left behind, and realizing that even our own views are shaped by, where we're standing today.
Exactly. History's not a monologue. It's a conversation. It's constantly being reevaluated and reinterpreted. As we learn more, as we find new evidence, and as our own values and understandings change, well, our understanding of the past changes right along with it.
Which brings us to this big idea that I think has been kind of woven through all of our deep dives today. It's this idea that history isn't just about the past. It's about now, too. The way we choose to remember and interpret history has a huge impact on how we see the world today, how we live our lives.
I couldn't agree more. Think about those national myths we were talking about. Those stories we tell ourselves about where our nation came from, they shape everything. Our identity, our values,
Mm.
even our political systems. It's crazy to think about.
Right, like the past isn't really past. It's still here with us, shaping our present in all these ways we don't even realize.
And it's important to recognize it, to have this back and forth with history,
Yeah.
to learn from it, to question it, to let it challenge us. That's how we grow.
But if we say that history is constructed and interpreted, does that mean there's no such thing as truth when it comes to the past?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Historians and philosophers have been wrestling with that one for centuries. I mean, there are definitely facts, things we can prove with evidence. But the way we connect those facts, how we build a story from them, well, that's always going to be colored by our own perspectives.
So it's not that the facts are wrong, it's how we understand them, how we give them meaning. That's where things get subjective.
Right? Like imagine you're looking at a painting. Two people can look at the same painting and see completely different things. It all depends on their own background, their experiences, their tastes.
So how do we deal with that? Like, if history is always going to be a little bit subjective, how do you make sure we're learning from it the right way?
We have to be critical thinkers. We have to question the stories we're told. We have to look for different viewpoints. And we have to be aware of our own biases. You know, we have to be humble and admit that we don't know everything and that what we think we know about the past could change.
And I think that's what makes learning about history so valuable. It's not about memorizing facts. It's about learning how to think critically, how to question, how to analyze, how to interpret. It's about having this conversation with the past that can help us understand our present and build a better future.
Perfectly said. And as we wrap up our deep dive into the world of Frederick II, we'll leave you with one final thought.
Ah.
If history is an ongoing conversation, then we all have a responsibility to participate in that conversation.
Love that. We shouldn't just sit back and listen to the stories we're told. We should be asking questions, challenging assumptions, adding our own voices.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So keep learning, keep questioning,
Yeah.
and keep that conversation going. And if you want to learn even more about Frederick II, make sure to check out the extra history article that got us started on this whole journey. And don't forget those books they recommended, Frederick II, The Wonder of the World by Richard E. Bressler, and Frederick II, A Medieval Emperor by David Abulafia.
Those are going straight to the top of my rating list. Well, that's it for our deep dive into the incredible world of Frederick II. Thanks for coming along with us.
It's been a pleasure. Until next time, keep exploring and keep asking those big questions.